Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, a podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 35, and today we're asking, how is John different from the Synoptic Gospels? It was always a meat and drink examination question when I was a student to ask how and why is John different from the Synoptics? And it's one of those nitty-gritty, bread and butter sort of questions that you get in New Testament introductions and in New Testament introductory courses. And yet it's something which many people who with only a passing familiarity with the New Testament simply don't pick up because they don't spend time reading the Gospels as a whole, and they haven't spent time working out that the sound of Jesus' voice differs depending on which Gospel you're looking at. But the difference between John and the Synoptic Gospels really is something which you can't underestimate. It's not just a kind of scholarly myth or something like that. It's something you really can't underestimate. I mean, let's remind ourselves that the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, are called synoptic because the material in them is so similar at so many points. So the kind of verbatim agreement that you get across Matthew, Mark and Luke really isn't there when you get to John's Gospel. And you can see that in even where John has parallels with synoptic material. So to take something like the feeding of the 5,000, for example, in the feeding of the 5,000, which is, one of the miracles which is shared across all four Gospels, one of the only ones that's shared across all four Gospels. In that story, in John chapter 6, you've got radical differences from the way that the same story is narrated in the synoptics. Even the word for fish in the loaves and fish is different, and the bread is often called barley loaves rather than just loaves. So even some of the basic vocabulary is different. But it's not just that when John has a parallel incident, when he has a parallel pericope, that his wording's different. It's also that John's Gospel lacks so many of the things that seem to be key in the Synoptic Gospels. There's no baptism story in John's Gospel. There's no transfiguration. There's no Gethsemane agony. And in fact, you even have in John's Gospel something which is Jesus flirting with the idea of agonizing like he does in the Synoptic Gethsemane account, and then deciding not to in John chapter 12. So all sorts of really major things that you have in the Synoptic Gospels are absent from John. I mean, think of how important exorcisms are in the Synoptic Gospels, stories of Jesus delivering people from unclean spirits, from demons, absent from John completely. And in fact, whereas the Synoptics really kind of pile up the number of stories of Jesus's healings, John just selects just a special number of them. I mean, it's usually said that he's got 7 signs, although that depends a little bit on how you count them in John's Gospel. But he has these special signs, and it's interesting that he calls them signs. He calls them signs presumably because he's trying to show the real symbolic value of each of these. So when he tells, for example, the story of the raising of Lazarus in John chapter 11, one of the accounts that is again unique to John, not in the Synoptics, when he tells that story, he uses the resurrection of Lazarus, the raising of Lazarus, as a means of reflecting on Jesus' own identity as the resurrection and the life. And that's typical of John. He will take a miracle, he'll take a story, and then he will try and point you to the significance of it, point you to what it tells you about Jesus and what it tells you about the story of Jesus. And it's not just that in John's Gospel you've got stories which are absent from the Synoptics and so on. It's also that the order is very different in John's Gospel. You don't have that same parallel order which in the Synoptics shows you that there's some kind of literary dependence somewhere. And the more you look at John's Gospel, the more you realise that its narrative structure has quite a different balance from the narrative structure of the Synoptics. It's sometimes said of Mark's Gospel that Mark is a passion narrative with an extended introduction. But if that's the case, then it's even more the case with John's Gospel, because half of John's Gospel, a whole half of John's Gospel, is devoted to the last 24 hours or so of Jesus' life, or at least the death and resurrection and the night before the crucifixion. So John chapter 13 begins the story of the night before Jesus was crucified, and then goes all the way through to the end of the Gospel with the crucifixion and resurrection. And then when you look at the first half of John's Gospel, there's another radical difference here from the Synoptics. The Synoptics are basically set in Galilee. The bulk of each of the Synoptic Gospels is set in Galilee. I mean, Luke is a slight exception here in that he begins his journey to Jerusalem already in the end of chapter 9. But even there, you still have to wait right towards the last chunk of the Gospel before you get to Jerusalem. Now, John is different from that. Most of the first half of the Gospel is also set in Jerusalem and Judea. You have a few little bits of Galilee. They're mainly focused at the beginning of chapter 2. You've got Cana. In chapter 6, you've got the feeding of the 5,000, which happens in Galilee. But so much of the rest of that first half of the Gospel is also set in Jerusalem. So if Mark is a passion narrative with an extended introduction, John is even more so. In fact, it's almost like a great big extended passion story, because even the first half of the Gospel, all the way through, it's prefiguring the passion, prefiguring what's going to happen in Jerusalem. And that's probably why John has the story of the cleansing of the temple in chapter 2, because the story of the cleansing of the temple in John's Gospel isn't at the end of the story like it is in the Synoptics, it's right at the beginning of the story. And John is kind of messes around with time in that way. He does interesting things with time and stretches and moves chronologies in quite different ways from the way that the Synoptics do things. And yet, in spite of all these differences between John and the Synoptics, I still don't think we've touched on the major difference between John and the Synoptics, because the major difference is in the way that Jesus himself is portrayed. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus constantly proclaims the kingdom of God. He talks about the kingdom of God. That's the key thing. He doesn't on the whole talk about himself. In John's Gospel, that's all changed. In John's Gospel, ego in Greek is a key word. Jesus standing up and saying, I, and then telling the reader about who he is. And that's why in John's Gospel, I am is such an important thing. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the bread of life. I am the true vine. And so it goes on. All the way through the Gospel, Jesus himself, the proclaimer. And it's an old cliche, but at the same time it's true, that in John's Gospel, the proclaimer has become the proclaimed. The person giving the message is himself the message in John's Gospel. That's why there are so many fewer references to the kingdom of God in John. And that's why everything centers on witness to Jesus. Everybody witnesses to Jesus. John the Baptist has no identity other than as a witness to Jesus. The Spirit witnesses to Jesus. The Scriptures witness to Jesus. Witness is an absolutely key thing in John's Gospel. Testimony is one of the Gospel's favourite words. And when you look at the way that John does his Christology, when he does his work on the identity of Jesus, you can actually see a very interesting pattern. Essentially, the Gospel is all about this stranger from heaven, to use a phrase coined by de Jonge and made famous by others writing about John's Gospel. The stranger from heaven who comes down to earth, calls his own, and promises them a place in the heaven to which he's returning. And so much of John's Christology is this kind of from above and below kind of material. I like to use when I'm teaching the analogy of the film E.T., which expresses beautifully that whole feeling of the alien who's come from elsewhere and has a special relationship with his own. So in E.T., Elliot is like the beloved disciple in John's Gospel. He witnesses to his own particular people. He calls his own particular people. He then suffers a death and is raised and eventually returns returns to the place where he's come from, just as the Messiah does in John's Gospel, and then promises that you'll be able to kind of phone him there, be in touch with him, just as you can carry on being in touch with Jesus in heaven, and ultimately, he will come back and rescue people. It's not a perfect analogy, but it kind of expresses something of Jesus as the alien figure in John's Gospel, the person that's come from elsewhere and then called his own so that they can go and be with him. It's the more you read John's Gospel, the more you can see this kind of pattern. It's really, really key. Now, of course, it's one thing to point out the differences between John and the Synoptics. It's quite another to be able to explain them. But that, I think, should be a topic for another episode of the NT Pod. Thanks for listening to this episode of the NT Pod. It's always good to have your company. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Goodacre, or you can find the NT Pod on iTunes or Duke University's iTunes U. I'll be along again soon with another episode. Thanks again for listening.